Here we go. Joe Paul Bryant from Waynesboro. I can't say it.
Waynesboro. We say
Waynesboro, Tennessee.
We say Waynesbury. We'll move that timer. That's all right. Well, I'm glad to be here this morning, and if you can't hear me, I wear hearing aids, and my wife says when I put them in that I talk low. So I'll try to keep it up. If you get to the point where you can't hear me, just wave at me or something, and maybe I'll remember what that means. If you would open your Bibles up, go ahead and be doing that. Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45. And we'll look at a few verses there in just a moment. Last year, I was asked to go to a missions retreat, which was down at Camp Maywood in Hamilton, Alabama. And the retreat was sponsored by World Evangelism. Lynn and I are pretty deeply involved with World Evangelism and several of the people there. And there are about 80 or so missionaries that gather up every year, and they have this little retreat. It's really nice, but they had asked me to come down and speak, and asked me on that occasion to kick off the retreat. And they assigned me a topic, and the topic was, what led you to bring the light? We were missionaries ourselves in Russia for about 5 years. And I told Wayne Barrier that I said, well, this will be the shortest lesson that I've ever given. And he said, why? And I said, because it's 2 words. God did. That's what led me to bring the light. God did that. Well, he said, you need to talk a little more about it. You can't just quit with that. And I said, well, okay, so we'll look at it a little more. I remember being in school at Freed Hardeman, and one of the classes I took, the instructor had asked us, we were all preacher boys, and he'd ask us to take a sermon. J.W. McGarvey preached some sermons back in the late 1800s, a whole series of them somewhere up in Kentucky. I couldn't tell you exactly where it was, but anyway, he had about, I guess, 12 or 15 sermons. I don't remember how many. And he asked us to take one, pick one out of this list, and read the sermon over and critique the sermon and outline the sermon and some different things. It was just kind of practice for us. And I picked a sermon on Joseph. Now, I picked Joseph because I was pretty familiar with the story of Joseph, and I thought it'd be easy. That's the reason I took it. But I learned something that I had never really thought of when I got to this story about Joseph. And this tied in with this topic that he had given me, what led you to bring the light. And I'm going to kind of adapt that a little bit this morning to you and kind of ask you, why are you here? Or how'd you get here? And I don't mean that you came in a car or a truck or you walked or whatever it was. I mean, how did you get here spiritually where you are right now? How did that happen? And I got to thinking about this lesson that McGarvey had preached and some of the points that he had made with regard to Joseph, and I found that it was very fascinating for me, and it fit right into this particular idea. So in Genesis chapter 45, if you looked in verse 4, and we'll just read verse 4 through verse 8. And Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Now listen to verse 8. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. Now, I want you to think about that. Because a lot of times we read these stories that are given to us in Scripture and we think, there was some really unique occurrence that happened with these individuals. And we don't realize a lot of times that the things that happened to them were just as common as anything you could think of. They were everyday occurrences. And the story of Joseph is just exactly that. It's a series of events that could have happened to anyone, with two exceptions. Two times God actually touched that chain of events. Once to interpret the dreams of the baker and the butler, and once to interpret the dream of Pharaoh. Other than that, God didn't have anything to do with this as far as a miraculous touching, a miraculous interference, or interceding, or anything like that. And that's what fascinated me. I mean, if you think about the question and look at this story kind of in reverse, what was it that brought about, after so many years, the migration of all these descendants of Abraham into Egypt to set them up for 400 years of bondage? Now that ties into this story, doesn't it? And our immediate answer is that we would say, well, it's because Joseph was the governor, second in command, over all Egypt. And I suppose that would be a correct answer. But then we have to ask the question, how did Joseph become the governor of all of Egypt? And again, our immediate answer is to say, well, he interpreted the dream of Pharaoh. Nobody else could do it. None of Pharaoh's magicians or his soothsayers or any of those people. None of them could do it. But Joseph did it. God intervened to give Joseph the ability to do that. And then you say, well, but how is it that Joseph was able to predict the things that were happening with regard to Pharaoh's dream, the famine, the years of plenty, and the famine that were coming? And you say, well, it's because all those magicians that he had called on couldn't do it. And that'd be right, except God did intervene. Well, how did Joseph happen to be called on to do that? And our answer is what? We say, well, the butler remembered that Joseph was in prison with him and that he had interpreted a dream for him and for the baker. But it was 2 years after the fact. Because the truth is, the butler forgot. He forgot about Joseph. He made Joseph a promise. He said, I'll speak to Pharaoh about you and I'll get you released. Now, if that had happened, just a thought, if the butler had remembered at that very moment in time and spoken to Pharaoh, where do you think Joseph might have been? Well, he could have been anywhere. He might not have still been in Egypt. He might have hightailed it out of there. He might have gone somewhere else. And we look at this and we start thinking, well, now some of this is, pretty interesting when we start thinking about it from this standpoint and working backwards and thinking about how God has a plan for everybody. He's got a plan for all of us. He has a plan for you. He had a plan for Joseph. Events just started happening to him, and as we continue on with that story, we could ask, how did he happen to interpret the dreams of the butler? Well, because he was in prison. Well, how did he get to be in prison? He got to be in prison because Potiphar's wife falsely accused him, right? Well, how did he happen to be in Potiphar's household? He was in Potiphar's household because Potiphar went to the slave market and bought him. Well, how did he happen to be a slave? Because his brothers had sold him into slavery. What was it that prompted those brothers to sell their own brother into slavery? I mean, they wanted to kill him. That was their initial thought. Let's just kill him and be done with him. Kill him, throw him in a pit. And Reuben talked him out of it. Reuben said, no, let's don't do that. So they decided that they would sell him into slavery. And they did. For a few pieces of silver, they sold him. What was it that caused them to sell him into slavery? It was their jealousy. Oh, we could say, well, he had told them about this dream that he had, but ultimately they were jealous over him. His father had given him that coat of many colors. You remember that? And they were jealous of him, and they put him into that pit, and they sold him, and all those events occurred. And what I want you to see is this. Every one of these events happened because God had a plan. 200 years before, God had said to Abraham, this is going to happen. So Abraham knew then, well, I'm not going to be here to see it. He knew this was going to occur. God drew them down to exactly where he wanted to be. Now, that's a long story. And it's given to us as an illustration to demonstrate the providence of God by which he can bring about his purposes without the intervention of miraculous power, except in the case of Joseph, a couple of times that we already mentioned. And when Joseph gave this interpretation of the dream to Pharaoh, it put him in the position that he needed to be in. God could have just wrought one great miracle, don't you think? He could have just taken all of Jacob's family and transported them over into the land of Egypt all at once and saved all of those things that happened. That's not the way it works. And so I ask you the question. I want you to think about what it is that has brought you here. Why are you here? What led you to this point? What brought you to this moment in time? Now, I looked at myself and I thought about the things that occurred in my life and how they happened and why they were brought about. And when I began to deliver that message, I thought, well, how did I wind up in Hamilton, Alabama, speaking to a bunch of missionaries? It's because I had been a missionary myself. Now, how did I wind up in Hamilton? Because I was preaching at a place called Mountain View, and I met a man by the name of Wayne Barrier. And Wayne Barrier is very, very much active in world evangelism. He's very active in mission work all over the world, touching literally millions of people. And it's a fascinating thing. But if I hadn't been at Mountain View, I may never have met him. So I started looking in relation to the story of Joseph and thinking, well, now let's work backwards on this just a little bit. How did I wind up at Mountain View? Because I was preaching in another congregation. I was preaching over in Hickman County. One Wednesday night, we couldn't make it to services. And we decided that we would attend services in Clifton, which is where we were living at the time. And when they finished their Bible class on Wednesday night, the preacher got up and he said, if anybody knows anybody who's looking for a preaching job, they're going to be needing a preacher at Mountain View because their preacher is retiring. And Lynn and I talked about it a little bit and said, well, why don't we go? Now, if I hadn't been at Clifton on that Wednesday night, I never would have heard that, never would have known about Mountain View, never would have given them a thought. We went out and we talked to the men out there. They decided that they'd like to give us a try, and so we were there for 18 years. Well, that's where I met Wayne, and that's what led me to go to Hamilton, Alabama. But then I got to thinking about it. How did I even get to Upper Sinkin, which is over in Hickman County? Because we had been back from Russia about 6 months, and they were a congregation that was helping support us. And they called me one day and said, can you help us out? And I said, well, I guess, I don't know. They said, our preacher has passed away, and we'd like somebody to come help us. And I said, well, I can come help you a little bit. 6 years we were there. And then that one Wednesday night, we couldn't make it over in time because of other obligations, and so we stayed at Clifton and so on and so forth, working back. How did they even come to support us in the work? Well, it was the sister of one of the women who attended Upper Sinking that I worked with, and she recommended that I contact them. Now, you see where this goes? You see how this leads? All of these chain of events that occur in our lives occur for a reason. And I think of it this way. I think of it as God putting people in our path. He puts people in our path to impact our lives, to direct us the way He wants us to go, how He intends for us to go, what He intends us to do, and He gives us the opportunity to make the choice and make the decision. Now, I followed that chain of events all the way back to Freed Hardeman. And I started thinking about all of these things, because it was at Freed Hardeman that I met my wife. Now, I didn't go to Freed Hardeman to meet her. She didn't like me to tell this. I went to Freed Hardeman because I had in my mind another woman. But she was already taken. And so Lynn was the second girl that I saw. I'm sorry. But God put her in my path. And these now almost 46 years, in just a few days, it'll be 46 years, we've made a pretty good team. And she's helped me, and hopefully I've helped her a little bit, but the fact is that I can trace all of this back to that, making that one decision to say, this is it. Why did I do this? God did this. Joseph said to his brothers, it wasn't you who put me here. It was God who put me here. I can see that now. I can understand that now. I can see that now. So me even standing before you today, I could say this, it wasn't you that put me here, it was God that put me here. God is the one who did all of this. God is the one who does all the things in our lives. So many times we're convinced that God has nothing to do with our lives. Oh, we talk to Him occasionally. We ask Him for help occasionally. We do some things, and we think, well, I hope God will, kind of look down on me and smile. But for the most part, we think God really doesn't get actively involved in our lives at all, that God doesn't even actively concern Himself with us at all. He just doesn't think about us at all. We just kind of exist. And God's there if we need Him. And I want to tell you, it's quite the contrary. When I grew up in Tunica, Mississippi, I had the good fortune to be impacted by a man named R.V. Scott. R.V. Scott was put in my path by God. I wanted to be R.V. Scott. Now, notice how I said that. I didn't want to be like him. I wanted to be him. I thought he was the grandest thing ever. Even as a 4 and 5-year-old boy, I can remember he encouraged me to preach. You believe that? He always encouraged me. I wanted to be him. I wanted to be the one that sat at the table. I remember sitting at the table with him one night, and he'd say, "Pass the ham, Sam." I said, "My name's not Sam." "Pass the peas, please." That was just the way he was. But there are things he said and there are things he did that I remember. He impacted my life as much or more than anybody that I can think of. Who do you think put him in my path? God did that. God is the one who put him in my path. God is the one who put him right in my way. And then I think about others. I think about some of my instructors at Freed Hardeman that I had the good fortune to know and to work with. I think about men like Dow Flatt, who I counted as a dear friend, and not just a teacher, but as a friend. Somebody that I could talk to, somebody that understood, somebody that was going through difficulties in his own life, somebody who could actually help. And there were others that I could think about as well. There are many local preachers that I've had the good fortune to know. I mean, how did we, you know how we got involved in mission work? Now just think about this. When I was in Hornwall, there was a fellow who was preaching at Springer by the name of Artie Collins. Artie Collins called me one day and he said, Joe Paul, we've got a special issue of the World Evangelist that's going to be done all by preachers in Lewis County. And he said, I want you to write an article for it, and we're going to put that in. And I said, well, I've never written an article about anything in my life. And he was writing one. Well, what do you want it to be on? He said, write it on plan of salvation, something simple. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So I did. They put it in. It went literally all over the world. I got a letter from a guy named J.P. McCourt in Belfast, North Ireland, who said, I've read your article in the World Evangelist, and I'd like your permission to print that and give it out and use it as a tract. We're a very small congregation. They were mostly family. And he said, we don't have a missionary here working with us. We don't have a local preacher working with us. He said, it's just a family. We get our sermons by video. And he said, we just do what we can. And I said, well, that's great. And I said, absolutely, you have my permission to do that. And I went and talked to my elders where I was preaching at Flat Rock. And I said, why don't we print this up as a tract and send them over a box of them, and we'll start videotaping all of our sermons and Bible classes, and we'll start sending them over to them. Now that was our first toe, if you will, in the water of mission work. Now how'd that happen? God did that. God put Artie Collins in my path so that Artie Collins could say to me, I need you to do this. I've already told you that he put my wife in my path. She's let me know that she's going to take me to heaven kicking and screaming. But that's where I'm going. And God did that. God put her in my path. Missionaries that we've known, God has put them in our path. Senders, encouragers, allowed us to go. We were supporting one of the missionaries in Russia and talked with my elders about going to check on the work over there and see what was actually going on. And they said, fine, go. And they sent us. And we got over there and we fell in love with the people. We fell in love with the idea of it. Everybody here, all our family, thought we'd lost our minds. We sold everything we had, loaded up our 4 kids, got on an airplane for the first time ever to go to Russia. Didn't know what we were doing, had no clue. But it was the most wonderful thing that we'd ever done. It was absolutely wonderful. I guess contagious now. My daughter and her husband, 4 of my grandchildren. Now I understand why people thought that we had lost our minds. Because I thought they had lost their minds. They said they're going to move to Tanzania, Africa, and do mission work, and they're going to be there for about 5 years. Who did that? Some people say it was my fault. God did that. God opened that door. My dad obeyed the gospel at 4. God put somebody in his path too. He put Mike McDaniel in his path. Now my dad's been exposed to a lot of preachers in his life, and he's never liked any of them. I mean, that's honest, and I can say that because he's not here yet. But he's never liked any of them. But this one, for whatever reason, God put Mike in my dad's path to have whatever influence on him that he could have. I couldn't have any influence on him. Tried and tried and tried for years and years. Nope, no good. But Mike did. Made an impression on him somehow. Now, all I'm telling you this is that we have to see God's plan in everything that happens. We sometimes miss it. We read these stories like the story of Joseph, and it's a great story, and it's a story that occupies so much space in Scripture. In fact, with the exception of Abraham, it is the most that's talked about. Joseph is the most talked about in the Old Testament, with the exception of Abraham. And there's a reason for that, because his story occupies a great deal of time, but it also teaches us a very valuable lesson. It teaches us just what he said in verse 8. It wasn't you who sent me here. It was God. We have to see God's plan in everything. There's a scripture in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, in which God is talking to the people of Israel. And he's saying to the people of Israel, he's saying, I know my thoughts about you. And my thoughts about you, he's saying to them, are with regard to peace and prosperity and things of that nature. This is following the time of bondage that they would have, 70 years of bondage in Babylon. And God says, I know this. Basically what he's saying is, he said, I know what plans I have for you. None of us like to think of ourselves as something so special that God would set aside a plan for us, but he does. He has a plan for each one of us, and it's a plan that impacts our lives. Now, I'm going to give you a few scriptures here to help you see God's plan. The first one is in Revelation chapter 3, verse 8. Revelation chapter 3, verse 8. When we read these things in Scripture, I think a lot of times we just kind of read them. We don't really think about them. What does God say to the church? This particular one, verse 8, is about, I think, the church of Philadelphia, right? So what does God say? I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Who opened the door? God did that. Jesus did that. He opened the door. Who can shut the door? Nobody can shut the door, because he's the one that opened it. You have an open door. You have an opportunity. You have a plan that God has for you. A lot of us think, well, I don't know if he has a plan for me or not. I'm not sure about that. I'm too old to do this. I'm too old to do that. Some of us think we're too young to do it. Some of us think we don't know enough to do it. God's got a plan for you. You just have to see what that plan is. Next one I want to give you is in Isaiah chapter 22. Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22. I don't have a clock. What time is it? I got about 10 more minutes. I need to know that, whether I have filler or whether I'm going to have to cut it short. I'm waiting on that bell to ring, and that's going to scare me. Isaiah 22, verse 22. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder. So he shall open, and none shall shut. And he shall shut, and none shall open. Who's doing the opening? God's doing that. God is doing that. Each one of us has an opportunity to touch somebody. None of us have the opportunity to touch all the same people. Each one of us. God has a plan for us. Now, you don't have to get on an airplane and fly off to Russia or to Tanzania or any of the other places in the world that you can think of. You can talk to the person right next door. How many times have you heard that? in our lives, how many times we heard this? Well, you can just talk to your next door neighbor. How many of us actually do it? Well, I don't want to make them mad. God's putting you in their path. That's His plan for you. And age has nothing to do with it, and health has nothing to do with it. It's just the fact that God has put you in that situation. That's your open door. That's what God has done for you. Let me give you another one. Let's see, jump back to 1 Corinthians. Chapter 16, verse 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 9. Paul says here, for a great door and effectual is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries. What's he saying? I've got an open door. Now, there's a lot of trouble that's going to face me here. There are a lot of people who are going to oppose me. We know something about the life of Paul, don't we? We know something about the story of Paul. We know something about a fellow who went through all kinds of difficulties. We know the story about a fellow who was stoned and left for dead and got up and went on, continued on with his preaching. He didn't let anything stop him. How many people did God use Paul for to put in their path? See, that's each one of us. We have those opportunities. Flip over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12. Still Paul, what did he say? Furthermore, when I came to Troas to preach Christ's gospel, and a door was opened unto me of the Lord. Who opened the door? Anybody? Who opened the door? Don't be bashful. God opened the door. Who will open the door for you? God will open the door for you. He's the one that can do it. God will use you. We just have to believe that. One more, this is the last one, I promise, is in Isaiah chapter 45. Verse 1. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Who's opening? God. Who gives you the opportunity? God does. Who brings all this about? God does. He's the one that makes all this happen. He's the one that drives this whole thing. He's the one that sets before you every opportunity that you have. He just gives you the choice to decide, what are you going to do? You have a chance. You have a chance to talk to somebody. You have a chance to reach out to somebody. You have a chance to be in somebody's path. God put you there for a reason. When Joseph said to his brothers what he said, it was a realization on his part. It wasn't you who did this. Now, they did some horrible things to him, didn't they? They were jealous of him. They sold him. They lied to the father. They did all those sorts of things. And we know the rest of that story. And it's such a fascinating story that's given to us about how he deals with those brothers when they come looking to buy grain. And he recognizes them immediately. My brothers. They don't recognize him, do they? No, they certainly didn't expect him to be the governor or whatever position he had. They didn't expect him to be such a powerful person. So they didn't know him. But he knew them. And his first thought was revenge. That was his first thought. And then when they came back, his thought was, I'll get my little brother with me, get rid of the rest of them. But he has this realization. And this realization is brought about when those older brothers said, take me. Don't take the little one. It'll kill our father. I'm paraphrasing that, obviously, but that's exactly what they meant. Don't take the little one. It'll kill our father. And God turned around and selected those men, those horrible men, those men who sold their own brother into slavery. God turned around and selected those men to be the heads of the tribes of Israel. You ever think about that? Why did he pick them? Because they were horrible. But God didn't pick them based on what they were. He picked them based on what they had become. And they had changed. And it's true for all of us. When we think about this, the people that we know, people that we see, people that we interact with, God's not picking them for what they were. He's picking them for what they had become or what they could be. It wasn't you that put me here. It was God. Now, I'm going to quit about 2 minutes early, and I hope that's all right. Thank you for your attention. Does anybody have a question or comment, anything you want to say? Y'all hadn't said a word this whole time. It's not like in Russia. When I was in Russia, we'd have people, I'd try to preach in Russian, and somebody would stand up and say, I don't think you used the right word. And they'd have a discussion with me about it, and my translator, if I had one. And then somebody else would stand up and say, no, I think you did use the right word. And then they would have a discussion. Sometimes sermons would last for, I don't know, a couple of hours. It just took a long time until we finally resolved it, and they said, okay, yeah, you can go ahead. They had questions in the middle of a sermon. Somebody just stand up and ask a question. I kind of got used to that. Here we're afraid to say anything. It's like we just sit there. We don't want to offend anybody. We certainly don't want to be here any longer than we have to be. Y'all would have had a come apart. We had one service over there, I remember. I do have a minute for this. We had one service over there, I remember, that lasted 6 hours. 6 hours. We had a young brother over there that was not a song leader that wanted to lead singing. Well, we didn't want to discourage him. We said, okay, fine. He got his songbook out. I have this little notepad. Our songbook had 70 songs in it. He opened his book and he went, number 1. You know where I'm going with this? When he finished number 1, which he didn't know, but we sung it anyway, he flipped the page and he said, number 2. How many songs we sang that day? 70. Good guess. We sang them all. And bless his heart, he was not a song leader, but we didn't want to discourage him. And then we had a brother, when it came time for the Lord's Supper, that got up and honestly, I think he preached about a 20-minute sermon. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard with regard to the Lord's Supper, about what it meant to the Christian and what it couldn't mean to those who were not. And it was just fabulous. And then we had a sermon by one of the guys that was working there. And then we broke and had tea and cookies and cakes. And then we had a Bible class that went on forever. Nobody was looking at their clock, going, when is this going to end? If we sing more than 3 songs, sometimes we get a little sideways. Imagine 70 songs, all in a row, no break. That takes a little while. I was glad we didn't have more songs. I'll quit now. Mike's coming in.